This is the Roots and All podcast, and I'm your host, Sarah Wilson. Join me as I talk about all aspects of gardening with some of the top horticulturists from around the world. Hello and welcome to this episode of the podcast. I'm delighted to be joined by Paul Spracklin, the author of The Dry Exotic Garden. Paul's deep passion for exotic plants and his expertise in creating stunning drought-tolerant landscapes is evident as we discuss his book, The Dry Exotic Garden, and the thrills and the challenges of gardening with plants that are adapted for tough conditions.
I came into gardening from a strange kind of oblique angle. I'd always been interested in houseplants, and I'd had a selection of various things that I'd been toting around various flats that I'd lived in. But I can pin it down summer 1985. We bought a place, a flat, an upstairs flat that had half a garden, which is the first time that I had outside space of my own. And I'd had this Fatsia japonica that I'd been torturing in various dusty corners for some while. And so I thought, I'll plant it outside and see what happens, not really knowing or understanding what would happen. And of course it thrived. And that set off a small thing in the back of my head. What else can I plant outside that looks like a house plant? So that got me on the road to exotic gardening. Then, after a few years and a few houses further on, it occurred to me that rather than trying to do this kind of sorcerer's apprentice to keep everything fully turgid and watered, maybe I should be looking for plants that would handle our dry climate here, because where I live, on near the coast, coastal Essex, the coastal strip of Essex is the driest part of England. We would get perhaps 50 to 52 centimetres of rain in a year, which isn't really very much. So trying to grow bananas, and especially tree ferns, you spend an awful lot of time and money, because, watering, if you're on a metre, it does add several £100 to your annual bill. So anyway, I started to look at cacti and succulents. And so that landed me pretty much where I am now, except 30 years on, a lot of experiments and experience later. So that's about it, really.
Excellent. So, you've written a book called The Dry Exotic Garden, and it's about xeriscaping. And I don't know if everybody listening will actually understand what that is. So could you explain that term?
The term xeriscaping, when you break it down, it kind of makes sense. There's a portmanteau of a couple of different terms. It combines the word landscaping and prefixes it with xeric, which is dry. So it's essentially landscaping in a dry climate, or a landscaping in such a way to mitigate being in a dry climate. And one of the chief ways you can achieve that is through plant choice. So that's essentially the kicking off point for the book.
It's a bit of a tangent, but I quite often like to ask this question because your book has got a lot of examples from your garden and other people's private gardens. And it kind of got me thinking, are there any particularly good xeriscapes in the UK that are public that people could go and visit? And I'm suspecting that they're probably tending to be in things like botanic gardens, but are there any others?
Not so much in botanic gardens, actually. I think probably the best xeriscaping on the biggest scale would be at the old vicarage at East Ruston. They have an area that I think is about 1.5 acres, which is big space, and it's completely devoted to, they call it the desert wash, and it's completely devoted to xeriscaping. It's another dry area of the country, that little coastal bit of Norfolk. Plus their soil also exacerbates that. They've got a very gravelly, flinty soil. They've been growing drought-tolerant plants, exotic plants, yuccas and molinas and agaves and all these kind of wonderful things for as long as anybody, really, but on this fantastically big scale. And so if you need or want to be inspired in this style of gardening, then really that's the place to go, because they've done a fantastic job.
And you mentioned the key word there, dry, and obviously they've got suitable soil. I think the received wisdom is that wet is the nemesis of cacti and succulents more than cold. And is that always the case?
To a large extent, yes. It's taken me a long time to find a portfolio of plants that can put up with my winters without any protection, which is the way I go forward at the moment. Every now and then a winter will come along and damage something that I thought was okay. But if you're prepared to protect plants and keep the wet away from them, then really that opens up not only the range of plants that you can grow, but also where it's possible to do it. There's a guy called Joel Robinson who was for some years growing cacti and succulents outside, way up on the wet side of the Pennines. And he would just put these rain shelters up and keep the plants as dry as he could for the winter. So by doing that, it really does open up growing drought-tolerant plants to wetter regions.
So thinking about the structures, I guess there's two ways that wet can get to a plant. So that's either via the roots or over the top through rain or snow. And would you say it's more important to protect the kind of crown of the plant, the top of it, than it is to worry about soil amendments and making sure there's good drainage? Or is it a combination of the two?
I think it's a combination of the two, really. I think if you're growing cacti and succulents, then one of the number one things that you should do is amend the soil and give them good drainage. Because even the range of plants that I grow, which I don't protect too much, they need reasonable drainage. If a succulent plant sits with its roots in wet soil all the way through the winter, then it's not going to be very happy at best. And at worst, you're going to lose it. So I think amending the soil so that it drains is a key thing. But also, not that many of the succulent plants that I grow are too happy with snow in the crown. So a physical protection to prevent snow from falling into the plant is also an important thing. I mean, again, I've got to a stage now where I'm trying to find the plants that will put up with the snow. But do I get as much snow as other regions? Probably not. So they're both important, being dry at the roots and also being covered over to sort of physically cover the plant. Both important if you're looking to grow things in wetter areas.
You've got some examples of overwintering plants and the various structures that you have built around them and other people. And sometimes they're weird and wacky, and sometimes they're actually quite architectural and beautiful. But I'm thinking about, obviously, we are now in winter in the UK. What does the garden look like over the winter, generally in an exotic garden? Does it look like a kind of strange building site, or can they still look quite beautiful over winter?
Oh, I think that's entirely down to the creativity and skills of the individual gardeners. Some of them can look quite nice, as you say. Some of them look quite shoddy, as long as they work. And if you're prepared to look at it, I have a sort of an island bed immediately behind the back of my house, which is the main view when I sit in my kitchen having my breakfast and lunch. That's the view that I have. And I used to put a polytunnel over it. And I don't anymore because I got sick to death of looking at the polytunnel every time I was having my breakfast. I wanted to look at my garden. So that was an individual choice for me. But some people are quite happy to do that if it means that they can grow a particular plant that they want to try. But it also depends where exactly it is in relation to the rest of the garden. If the space that you're covering is somewhere that you don't of necessity look at all the time, then perhaps it's not quite so important how neat it is.
No. So I have killed my fair share of cacti and succulents over the years. In fact, probably more than my fair share, actually, now I reflect on it. But what would you say are good beginner's plants that are fairly easy? I mean, I think we all get bowled over by the beauty of these plants and we think, yes, I must have that, I must have that. Or maybe that's just me being greedy. But if you could say to people, OK, start here. These are simple to look after. They're relatively reliable. What would your choices be?
This is for planting out in the garden, yes?
Yes, yes.
Well, the sort of number one group of plants for structure would be yuccas because they're much more tolerant of what goes on at the roots. But to give an example of a yucca, my favourite yucca of all would have to be Yucca linearifolia. It's an absolutely gorgeous plant from the northeast of Mexico, and it's one that I've seen in habitat several times in various places. And it always seems to grow on the north side of the ridge of the mountain or on the shady side of a canyon. So it's a plant that doesn't demand being out in the open, hot sunshine like some succulent plants. It's also a lot more tolerant of moisture at the roots. So that would be my number one yucca to try and grow. My number one favourite agave to grow, if you have the space for it, because most of the ones I like are big ones, would be agave ovatifolia. It's proving to be very hard, very moisture tolerant. Even in winter, it seems to enjoy having rainfall. Most of the best specimens I've seen of it have been in much wetter areas than my plants, and they grow much more quickly as well. So that would be my recommendation for an agave. I would recommend people to dive into the genus of Nolina, because there are some fantastic sculptural plants. Not that many gardeners know about Nolinas, but I think they're brilliant things. And I think the hardiest one, and the one that can be grown, I think, anywhere in the country, hardiest or most wet tolerant one, is Nolina hibernica, which has a lot to commend it. But my favourite is Nolina nelsoni. That has something special. It has very rigid leaves, and you end up with something that looks like a giant silver starburst in the garden. It's easily the match of any yucca for just an impact in the garden. It's a fabulous thing. How much further do you want to? I mean, there's
yeah,
lots.
I expect you could go on forever. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely.
Well, no, I think if anyone wants to know any more, they need to get the book, obviously.
Absolutely.
Go
Absolutely.
get the book. It's full of really good examples. And there were some in there that I just thought, oh, God, I love those. There were two spectacular ones that really stood out to me. The first one is aloe polyphylla, which I have purchased in the past and killed. But whenever I see it, I just fall in love with it. I think, oh, I must have that. But yeah, is that easy to grow?
I absolutely struggle with that. I've lost count of how many I've killed. I'm trying again. I have two more growing. One of them, surprisingly, seems to be doing okay. So I'm told the trick is to never look at it. So I've planted it in a part of the garden that I don't get to very often. So I rarely look at it. But I sneak a sideways glance every now and then. And it seems to be doing okay, so fingers crossed. But yes, what a plant. Fantastic.
Yeah, it is. And the other one that really jumped out at me, and I'm going to pronounce this wrong, I suspect, is Yucca queretoroensis.
Yeah, that's easy when you break it down, actually. It comes from the state of Querétaro. So it's Yucca queretoroensis. And that is unfeasibly beautiful. Of the plants that I've seen growing in habitat in Mexico, that I think is the most beautiful in its setting, because it lives in sheer-sided canyons, which are absolutely scary. Ordinarily, most of the canyons that it inhabits, you can't get to because they're too steep. But there's a couple that they've discovered that they're rich in ore, and they've made mines down in the bottom of the canyon. They've cut roads into the side of the canyon. And just in these two places, there are populations of it that are quite accessible. So it's possible, as long as you've got a strong nerve, because these roads are really scary. I had terrible vertigo and I was petrified. I wouldn't consider driving, but there are braver souls than me behind the wheels. Anyway, just an absolutely beautiful thing. If you catch that with low sunlight, so that the sun catches the side of the dome of foliage, it is just utterly beautiful.
And when I saw them in your book as well, there were a lot of ones where you gave examples and you photographed them and you said, this is a really good example of this plant growing in this country. And I get the impression that actually it's quite rare to grow something to its full potential over here. You have to put in a lot of work. Does that mean there's a lot of disappointment involved in this, if you can't get it to look as spectacular as it would in its kind of native habitat?
I think actually what I would have meant by saying that is that there's an awful lot of these that just haven't been growing, so they haven't reached their full potential yet, just because they've only been available for a short while, or people haven't grown them outside for a short while. And as plants get older and more established, then they can deal with the elements a little bit better. But yes, I mean, there are always disappointments. I mean, every winter is different. Every year, something strange will come along and plants will disappoint. But plants will also delight as well. You really rejoice about those, and they're really good ones. And the key, I think, is to keep the sense of adventure and don't get disheartened by losses. Just, as I think I say in the book, just think about what happened. Do I want to try this plant again? Where could I grow it that would be different? Or should I protect it? Or is there something I could have done to prevent that being damaged? But if not, there's plenty more things to grow.
I think it's an exercise in patience and perseverance. But also, when I was reading through the book, I realised that you've had a number of tussles with these plants, and I thought it's probably also an exercise in bravery and maybe caution, because they can injure you, can't they?
Oh, absolutely. I've scars and fresh scratches on my forearms, hands, normally got a spine or 3 embedded in my skin somewhere. Yeah, so you have to be careful. You sort of gradually work out a way how to move these things without ending up in the A&E. But I don't know why that appeals. I don't think it is a macho male thing, because there's an awful lot of xeric gardeners that are friends of mine that are females. So I don't think it is predominantly a male thing. It's, you're not taming the beast. It's, I don't know what it is, just form and structure and the beauty of that, really. But yes, they can be quite dangerous.
They're dangerous in the wild to wildlife, and they're fully armoured. What would you say is the most tricky plant that you deal with in that respect, that you have to be very, very careful around?
It's probably the ones that don't look so bad. The one that causes me the most pain when I'm careless around it, there's a plant in there. I can't remember what genus I kept it in for the book. It's Trichocereus chicondantii, but it could have been Echinopsis chicondantii. Anyway, it's one that is on the front cover. It sprawls around the ground like a strange group of mating snakes or a Medusa head, whatever your imagination conjures up. And it doesn't have big, wicked-looking spines. It just has lots of short spines. So it's easy to overlook it, I think. Those little spines detach and become embedded in your skin, and it can be really quite painful for quite a long time. I'm talking weeks, not days, if you get those little spines in, because you just can't see them, and it's next to impossible to get them out. I think shaving the skin is one thing that maybe helps, but it's not good. But I have a little story about being hurt by a cactus. Was the big Trichocereus tashekii that's on the front of the south wall of my house. That's been there a long time. A few years ago, we decided we'd have the walls covered in cladding. And so we had scaffolding erected around the house so that we could access the walls easily, and mentioned to the scaffolders that, they ought to be extremely careful for 2 reasons. One, that it would hurt. And the second was that it was probably the only one like it, or certainly the biggest example growing outside in this country. Now, scaffolders, I believe, are one of the toughest types of human on the planet. They're extremely hard guys. And these fellas, they did very well. They built a little cradle around the cactus, and one of them got a bit complacent and he walked backwards into the cactus and pricked himself all down his forearm. And he was actually off work for about a week. So I take that as indicative of the level of poison that these things have got in their spines. To actually injure a scaffolder enough for him to be off work for a week was quite something.
Wow. Maybe we're not exploring the potential of these things as security.
Yeah, that would work. Have them underneath your windows. It would certainly do a good job.
Thank you very much to Paul for speaking about his amazing work, and thanks to you for listening. If you like this episode, I recommend checking out episode 132, The Jungle Garden, and episode 146, Seeking Rare Plants. You can download or listen to the podcast direct from the website rootsandall.co.uk. Please also check out my Patreon, where you can make a one-off donation or take out a monthly subscription to help support the podcast. Because if you enjoy the show, please help it continue. I also have a GoFundMe where you can make a one-off donation. Even a one-off donation of £1 helps, and I'll be really grateful for your support. So please go to Patreon or GoFundMe and search for Roots and All Podcast.